Welcome back to another episode of the Daily Wrestling News Show, where we are on a mission to teach, learn, and remember the history of professional wrestling with everyone that wants to join us. I'm excited for today's episode. It's another special where we're covering the tales from the territory. So I'm here with John DeConi. And if you're watching on video, you have the privilege of knowing I'm wearing a Bret Hart shirt and I've got the Bret Hart shades on. And we are talking about Stampede Wrestling, John.
Yes, indeed. I am so glad that those glasses didn't get washed into your background there.
I know.
They look sweet.
Good. They are impossible to see through. I will tell you that. So I'm going to lift them up on my forehead and we'll do the show that way. But so yeah, you can't talk about Calgary or Stampede, I guess, without talking about Bret Hart. But I will say that whole show they did last night, they managed to do that pretty much entirely. Like there were no it was Bret Hart like breaking into the system or the business a little bit in terms of like smartening up and like going to the shows as a kid. But there were no like Bret Hart in Stampede stories, despite him being one of the panelists.
Yeah, it was all about, him as a kid, like you said, learning the business, being around the business, and it's at the start not really understanding the business, but he was there to he was more there just like everyone else, which I guess was a theme running through the episode, to tell Stu stories and to do his impersonation.
Yeah. Oh my God. And it wasn't just Bret. Those guys, I don't know if they all did Stu impressions, but every Stu impression I heard was like spot on. I've never tried. I'm gonna have to try one later. Maybe it's just a really easy one to do. But the panelists were Dr. D, David Schultz, Abdullah the Butcher, and No Class Bobby Bass. And they did talk about a little bit about each of them in Calgary and stuff. And David Schultz is obviously. I shouldn't say obviously, because there's like a generation of people that probably don't know who he is. But he's the guy who slapped John Stossel for calling wrestling fake. And there's a whole episode of Dark Side of the Ring on him. But he spent 3 years in Calgary, and there was one little nugget in there that I caught. He drove himself everywhere.
Yes.
And when they were talking about traveling to shows in that like negative 50-degree Alberta winters, where you couldn't see, and he would just take his hands off the steering wheel and basically let God take over, I guess.
Jesus.
But yeah, that was his story. And then Abdullah the Butcher, he spent a lot of time there. Some of the hottest angles, I guess, were Abdullah the Butcher versus Stu Hart as they got into. And then No Class Bobby Bass is not somebody that I knew.
No.
Even
Bret busted his balls for kind of being an unknown, but
yes.
I'm sure they loved him in Calgary.
It was the episode closed with all these great people came out of Stampede. Stampede really got a lot of people started, like including myself and David Schultz. He turned and you and Abdullah and he goes, and Bobby, you did your best. So the promotion operated for 50 years in Western Canada. The intro, it was funny. They talked about all this talent that got their start there in Stampede. There was pictures of Bret Hart, pictures of Owen, pictures of Davey, pictures of Dynamite, and others. But really, besides the very end when Bret made that comment and this part of the intro, they didn't really talk about guys getting their start there so much.
No, exactly, because I'm sure there was a laundry list of people they could have added, and just it was all that, I guess, as they said later in the show, you went to Calgary, you worked in Calgary, even if you just there was one portion where they said Andre for a long time there came in just for Stampede week, and guys loved going there, and you left there with so many stories.
Yes, yeah.
So basically they filled the hour, or the 40 plus minutes that would actually air between the commercials, with just stories.
Yep.
You didn't have to get into the resume of Calgary, which is extensive.
The other thing is they talked about the wrestling bear in the intro, and then didn't tell any stories about that. It's kind of like they teased you up for like a sequel or something.
I was looking forward to Brett talking about the bear, licking his feet clean, and all the stuff that we read in the book about the bear. And we didn't
That's
get to the
right.
bear.
Yeah, and so there was a little bit of overlap. If you've read Bret Hart's autobiography, Hitman, there was a little bit of overlap. I think the most notable overlap was the Andre the Giant story. I remember that crystal clear from the book.
Absolutely.
Was there other ones that you thought that you recalled coming right out of the book?
What else came right out of the book? Oh, the one about wrestling camp. About
Oh,
I guess
the coaches.
Stu, yeah, the Stu taking Brett to a wrestling camp when he was, I guess, I don't know, maybe 13, 14. And the coaches, who were real wrestling guys,
Mhm, mhm.
started, they obviously recognized Stu because he was an icon in that area, and started busting his chops about, I guess they didn't come out and say fake, but Stu
Yeah.
caught on pretty quickly that they were kind of busting his balls without getting right in his face and saying it. And Stu, I guess, was a touchy feely kind of guy. He was kind of, shaking one guy's hand while patting the other one on the back. And Brett tells this hilarious story how Stu starts working his way out of his shoes as he's, kind of
Yeah.
buddying up to these guys who he knows are busting his balls. And within seconds, he's got one of these real wrestling coaches on the ground. He's stretching him. He's making him scream, and he's talking to the kids like, "Okay, and
Yeah.
now what to do here?" And as he's making this coach scream for mercy, and
Yeah.
yeah, that was one of the best ones of the night.
Well, let me show you this one move. That's kind of what the let me show you
Yeah, let me show you
over and
this.
over.
Let me show you this.
That was like Stu Hart's like pickup line. Let me show you this one move. And he's got next thing you know, the guy's on the ground screaming or whatever. But yeah, and there were dungeon stories, of course. We probably should get into the Andre the Giant story because it is a pretty good one. I think it was maybe the highlight for me, even though I had heard the story. I think it's the highlight of the show. Is Andre would come in and he loved coming to Calgary, and so there was one incident where he came and he had the next day he had booking in Montana. So he had an 8 o'clock flight out that got canceled. And so Stu sent Brett and his brother Smith to pick up Andre and hopefully get him to the airport for the 12 o'clock flight that would get him into Montana in time for the show. Well, they arrived at the hotel to pick up Andre, and they only had about 30 minutes before the flight took off. And so Andre's like, we're not going to make the flight. And Smith's like, oh, we're going to try. So Andre gets in, Brett's in the passenger side, Smith's driving, and he breaks every vehicle law that you can think of. Drives, over the middle of the road and all that kind of stuff. And the cops are trailing him and everything. As soon as they get to the airport, Smith and Andre jump out. They go to the airport to see if they can get Andre on this flight. Brett stays in the car as the cops roll up and with their guns drawn to tell Brett to get out of the car. And so Brett tells the whole story about Andre trying to get to Montana, embellishes a little bit, says his brother Smith has a lot at stake in the show. And out come Andre and Smith from the airport. Andre had, of course, did not make the flight, and so Smith just holds his hands out to be cuffed, and the cops actually say, if I catch you so much as jaywalking, you're going behind bars. But they let him off with a warning. So I guess the rub to that is Andre never went back to Calgary. He never spoke to Stu Hart again.
Yeah, and Stu really, I guess, never got the story.
Yeah.
Like every once in a while, Stu would say, if they had any, reason to be in the same room as Andre or whatever, he wouldn't even look at them. And Stu would often ask, like, "What the hell's his problem? Like,
Yeah.
what's going on there?" And the weird thing was that Brett Brett kind of said, like, yeah, he never spoke to me either. But then, kind of a couple minutes later, went like, eventually he warmed back up to me once I was in the WWE, and we had to be in the same locker room, but it was never the same.
Yeah.
But yeah, he never spoke to Stu again. Never came back to Calgary for another Stampede week of shows, and meanwhile, Smith, the eldest son, ruined a relationship and never paid for it from Stu because Stu never got the full story.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I was wondering your take on this. Brett talked about Abdullah the Butcher with such fondness in his book, and then we see what appeared to be his importance to the territory here. Brett even said that when Abdullah came into town, like they were hot. They sold a lot of tickets, filled up the arenas and stuff. I never watched a lot of Abdullah the Butcher. I know he was around, but and a deathmatch staple, but I never really much had a lot of exposure to him in the 80s or anything. I wondered about you.
Yeah, likewise. As I tend to say every week on these territories episodes, I'm a New Jersey kid. All
Yep.
you really got around here was WWF stuff, and he once it stopped being the territories, I don't think Abdullah spent any time. So
Yeah.
probably the only Abdullah match I ever saw live was on.
He got electrocuted.
Not even that. I don't think I was even watching WCW at that time. I'm talking about what was it, Legends of Wrestling, the worst pay-per-view of all time.
Yes.
Yeah, that was probably the only match of his I ever saw live. And obviously I've seen dozens of clips of him bleeding profusely, but never actually watched the man wrestle.
But he looked great on camera. I mean, like, I don't understand that, but he looks amazing.
I just read Wikipedia? Well, assuming that this was taped in the last year, probably even less.
Yeah.
He's 80 years old.
Wow. He's got some new chompers, I'll tell you that.
Sure. But I mean, just looking at the man's face, if you take out the fact that, he's got the Grand Canyon running through his scalp, just looking at his face, I could not believe, because I'm thinking to myself, like, Brett tells these stories of being very young when Abby, as he lovingly refers to him, came into the territory. And I'm looking at Brett and I'm like, yeah, Brett's in, yeah. And I'm trying to do the math. So I just went to Wikipedia and he's 81 years old, Abdullah the Butcher. Holy cow.
Yeah, he looks all right. Really. I don't think I think they showed clips of everybody shaking hands, like, very briefly, and I think he was sitting down for that, so I don't know how well he gets around and stuff, but yeah, good. That makes sense because the main feud that Brett talked about with Abdullah was Stu Hart, so it had to be a long, long time ago. So, all of these episodes, and I guess you should kind of know it from the way they set the whole show up. The Rock says in the intro, it's the golden age of professional wrestling when the wrestling business was protected and the passionate fans still believed. The kayfabe piece runs through all of these shows, and they talk about kayfabe in Calgary. And it was surprising to me. David Schultz told a story very similar to a Jerry Lawler story from the first episode.
Yes.
Where he goes out to the parking lot and there's somebody standing with a great big boulder ready to throw it through his windshield.
He handled it a little different than Jerry, though.
He sure did. Where Jerry was got in his car and was ready to run the guy over, only to find out his tires had been slashed. David Schultz said, "Don't throw that rock at anybody." And then within seconds, smacked the guy across the face with a hockey stick. And blood went everywhere, and then turned around and did the same to his brother who was standing there. Not the same. He took that guy out with the shins.
Yes.
And lovingly says, "Oh, I still have that hockey stick. It makes me great."
Schultz obviously has a great sense of humor.
Yes.
Yeah. Even the title of his book, "Don't Call Me Fake," based around the whole Stossel incident. So he good sense of humor on Dr. D.
Yes, absolutely. And then Abdullah the Butcher, who, he's the wild man from Sudan.
Madman from Sudan.
Madman. Yeah, madman from Sudan. They tell us in here he's actually from Windsor, Ontario, which is right over the border from Detroit.
Just north of Detroit.
Yeah. I've been in Windsor before. I did the half marathon that starts in Detroit, crosses the bridge, and then comes back under the tunnel. So you go over, and that's where you are, is Windsor. So I know where he's from. And but he, to keep kayfabe like they did in this era, Abdul the Butcher did not speak a lick of English. So he would go to restaurants and he would point and he would, mutter things. And then finally some waitress kind of leans down and says, Abdullah, I won't tell anyone, but I know you can talk.
He'd speak gibberish. He'd pick up, one word here or there that he knew was, be it Sudanese or one of the other, dialects in the area, and he would just throw it in with a bunch of garbage. But it's gotta keep the gimmick strong.
Yeah. So as you watch these Tales for the Territories, you can almost count on like 2 or 3 things they're going to talk about. They're going to end the episode talking about what the legacy of the territory is. And in the middle someplace, they're going to talk about a super hot angle. They're going to talk about jokes, ribs, and we had like a classic in this one. And they're going to super hot angle, ribs, and they're going to talk about the kayfabe piece.
Yes.
So, man, a Mabel party. You ever been to a Mabel party, John?
Thank God, no.
This was a new one to me. I had never heard anything like this, but it feels like something that could get done in Hollywood, but not in real life. But geez, so an elaborate joke that many wrestlers had to go in on, I guess, was that. And they talk about doing it to Antonio the Great, who's this big, over 6 foot, big man, maybe 500 pounds or something like that. And they tell him that there's this super hot woman who really into the wrestlers, loves big men, and but also her husband goes out of town quite often. So they're going to go out there to her house for a party. And so they all go out and they're there, and the woman starts getting a little frisky. She's flirtatious, and Brett says, maybe she's like, starts to maybe remove her blouse or something. And all of a sudden, the husband kicks the door in, he's got a shotgun, and starts firing off rounds into the chests of some of these wrestlers who all of a sudden are bleeding because they're wrestlers and they got blood packs or whatever. And of course, the husband is firing blanks at them, but Antonio's not in on it, so he's running out the front door and he goes off and into the Canadian wilderness, I guess, because it's out in the country. And some period of time later, he returns with the Royal Canadian Police, and they go in to check things out. And I guess they think it's funny too. Sit down, have a couple of drinks, but that's what a Mabel party is. So poor Antonio the Great, he didn't get any action from the lady, and boy, he had a stressful night.
Yeah, they said in this one, I guess this was a rib that was pulled on many people, but in the case of Antonio, it kind of messed him up. He had a little PTSD from the whole situation, especially because, like you said, the husband who returns home fires a shotgun with blanks, of course. But you see one of your buddies get, you think, murdered in front of you, and you go screaming out of the house, and the victim runs for his life, and the RCMPs bring him back. Everyone is in on the joke but him, and apparently Antonio was shook over the whole deal.
That is a joke. I mean,
oof.
It puts that whole Dr. D talked about putting laxatives in brownies or cookies. Like, it doesn't compare.
No,
it's not close.
Although, as sophomoric and as many times as you heard that, whether it be legend or not, the Dr. D story was my favorite of the show for this reason. They say timing is everything in comedy.
Yeah.
So, the story goes that Dr. D got dosed with LSD because he left his coffee unattended, which is something you just didn't do in the locker rooms. To get back at the guys, he had his wife bake cookies. He crushed up some X-Lax, put them in them. Everybody got a little sick. The next time, he got liquid horse laxative, brought another batch of cookies, and everyone got violently ill. And again, it's a sophomoric, it's just a stupid story, and whatever. And Brett goes like, how about that? I just keep learning. You learn something new every day. And I was probably watching this at 2:00 in the morning. I burst out laughing because Dr. D kind of looks at him and goes like, see, I kept you away from the bad food. I'll bet you didn't want a hot dog after that. Stone-faced Brett goes, I've never eaten one again to this day. Favorite moment of the whole episode.
I don't know if that's BS or not, but it is funny.
If it was delivered perfectly.
Yeah, exactly. So the other thing they talked, I mentioned the 4 or 5 things that you're going to get every one of these Tales from the Territory episodes. The other one's the super hot angle. And the one that they talked about here was Archie the Stomper versus Bad News Allen, was set to be a super white hot angle in kind of the waning days of the Territory, really. To set things up, Archie Stomper was the villain in the Territory for a long time. I mean, it goes back to when Stu was wrestling. So Brett recalled when he was just a little boy, Archie Stomper would cut these promos where he wanted to pile drive Helen Hart on the interstate, and he would beat up the Hart kids all around the yard, and he wanted to kill Stu Hart. And Brett kind of got smart to the business when he saw Archie the Stomper walk up to the front door and get his payoff from Helen during what was a cordial exchange, I guess I would say. That and Stu Hart looking for his cast every time the milkman came around. That's how Brett got smartened up to the business. But anyway, you have this long-time villain in the Territory who they want to turn babyface basically at the end of his career. And what they're going to do is they're going to team him up with Bad News Allen, who just bad news maybe isn't the right phrase. Maybe he just was bad.
Man, yeah.
Yeah. So they're going to team up with Bad News Allen, and the whole rub is the whole way it's going to happen is that Bad News will turn on Archie, effectively making Archie the babyface. And the way he's going to do that is he's going to hit a pile driver on Archie's son, on pile driver on the floor. So Bad News says, "Hey, should I ask Bruce? Should I use my fork?" Because Bad News had a reputation for pulling out a fork and stabbing his opponents in the forehead, which would get him suspended. So Bruce is like, no, don't use your fork. The commission's out there, and they're looking for any reason possible to suspend any of us. So please don't do that. So everything goes as planned. Bad News hits that pile driver, and then he uses the fork, of course, because it's Bad News. And then he beats up a 90-year-old man on the way out, like a fan, like legitimately beats him up. And I guess this was the straw that broke the camel's back for Ed Whalen, the commentator. He's just like, I'm done. I'm quitting because this is just too violent. Bad News is beating up fans. So that doesn't go as planned. And then the next night in Edmonton, Bad News beats up another fan, this time with a steel chair, repeatedly. And that caused Stu Hart to lose his wrestling license in Edmonton, and it got Bad News suspended. So the super white hot angle that they're supposed to have between Archie the Stomper and Bad News, well, it was effective in the fact that they got the 2 matches, basically. Archie was turned babyface. They couldn't really get much of a feud because Bad News was suspended everywhere, and he killed 2 towns in 2 nights.
The astonishing thing to me is, and it kind of goes beyond the episode, seeing Bad News Allen in this light. I mean, so they had already talked about the fact that he was trained by Inoki. He got most of his training in Japan. Came over here and kind of refused to lighten up from the stiff Japanese style, and that pissed a lot of guys off. He goes out and does this stuff, continues to get himself legitimately suspended by the commission because this wasn't part of kayfabe. The commissions, they had some rule over this, and that's how they lost Edmonton. Stu lost his license in Edmonton because of this. It's astonishing to me, for as brief as his time was. Vince talked to Stu. Of course, there's another story about Vince being the devil in this as well. Yeah. Vince had communication with Stu. I'm stunned that Vince would bring this man into the company. Bad News Allen, of course, being Bad News Brown. I can't believe he even made it to the WWF with a reputation like this. Like, this guy was a problem.
Yeah. And he was there for multiple years. I know brief, but at least more than 2. I mean, because he was.
And Brett had to work with him.
That's right. Brett had to work with him at 4.
Changes.
Yeah. So yeah, so that's a crazy story too, because I mean, Brett even credits Bad News in that light for kind of killing the whole territory.
Yes.
Killed the 2 towns, but Brett said the territory never recovered. It was kind of in the waning days.
Yeah, that was like December 83.
Yeah.
That he had the incident in, I forget where the first city was, but the second one being in Edmonton. And Stu sells to Vince in August of 84.
Right. For $200,000 or something like that, which Vince never paid a dime of. So and you know, that's another interesting thing about this is that the Rock's $7 production is heavily involved, and that's how they got. They were able to get, I think, some footage. They were able to get Jerry Lawler, and I presume Jeff Jarrett at the time was probably vice president in WWE. He has since left, but it's surprising how many bad stories of Vince McMahon are making air, because when it talks about the legacy, like just before the legacy portion of each of these shows, they kind of talk about how the territory died. It's like, well, that Vince McMahon. When you think of the AWA specifically, where Hogan no showed, and then because Vince paid him off, and then this one where Vince, I guess, bought out the territory without ever really paying Stu.
Yep. Yeah, I guess Stu's payment was getting Brett, Owen, Neidhart, and not Davey Boy, but
Dynamite.
Dynamite, yeah, getting them jobs. Basically was the only tangible thing that Stu got out of the deal, because Vince stiffed it, which is just stunning.
Yeah, it is.
How no one has ever physically, I mean, you're talking about now. I mean, at the top of the show, they do say that Stu Hart was a rare man of honor in a con man's world, which was one of my favorite quotes of the show. But in the other territories where he screwed people, I cannot believe that someone didn't at some point come for Vince physically.
Yeah,
the amount of dirty pool that he played with all these territories, and the fact that he essentially blew up and destroyed territorial wrestling.
Yeah, in a big way. And I guess so. At that point, we are kind of at the legacy portion. Stu closed up everything, sold everything to Vince McMahon. The territory did reopen later, because I think that this was like a handshake deal between Stu and Vince. Yeah. It doesn't appear that there would be any contracts involved, because they were able to reopen Stampede. Vince never had to pay anything. If there was a contract of any kind involved, both would be on the hook for that. So, but Brett said the legacy had more to do with the people that came out of it, people that got their starts in Calgary. We saw the Dynamite footage. We saw Jim Neidhart, Bret Hart, Owen Hart, Davey, even Brian Pillman. We saw a very small video with him in there. So Brett says it's really those people. And then during the territory days, like you said, it was people came into Calgary and they made a bunch of memories, and then they would leave the territory and tell their stories. And even Ernie Ladd, who had never met Stu Hart, loved telling Stu Hart stories. And Brett says, "When did you ever meet Stu?" And he's like, "Oh, I never did." Just that's how good the stories were coming out of Calgary. So
if you were in a wrestling locker room, you heard Stu Hart stories. It didn't matter where you were actually in that locker room.
Yeah. They said in the intro, they said that the territory kind of mirrored the man, Stu Hart. Yes. What they said was it was respected, a little rough around the edges, and tough as hell. I thought that was a good way to put it. Next week, John, is Polynesian Pro Wrestling. Now, I don't know. I couldn't really tell who all the people were, but it looks like Kevin Sullivan will be back.
Yeah, Kevin Sullivan was definitely back, and there were 2 other faces that I know I recognize, but I mean, even last night, Dr. D, Dave Schultz, I'm looking at him and I'm like, I know him. Why do until they put the chyron on, I'm like, yeah, that's who it is. Like, so many of these guys. So yeah, there's 2 other guys at least that I saw in the preview that I know I'm going to know the names when they say them, but I just couldn't place them. But once again, Kevin Sullivan is back.
Yep, same. They look very familiar. I just couldn't quite place the name to them. So, and this will be an interesting one because they've $7 has done a lot with Polynesian Pro Wrestling between the Young Rock series and everything. So they've kind of like hit into a lot of that stuff already. So I'll be interested to see what stories they pull out. And I went looking at one point for Polynesian Pro Wrestling to find footage and stuff like that, and find just anything even written. And we really don't have a lot of records that I can tell from that territory. So I'll be really interested to hear, some firsthand accounts.
Sure. And the crazy thing is, obviously Young Rock is based on, but not, it's certainly not documentary footage. But the way that show makes it look, it feels like every name from the WWF came through there at one point. So, if any of that is close to being true, there should be some excellent stories with names.
I feel like I don't know because I haven't really analyzed this, but I feel like you've got about 30 years of stories that are being compressed into about 3 years of Young Rock.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You have the whole life of the territory that's like all going to happen during little Dewey's childhood. But we'll get into that next week. That'll be a fun episode for us to dig into. So, John, anything else about Stampede before we go?
No, just it was probably the first episode where at the end of all the episodes I thought were good, even the one territory where the stories were a little light. They all still were very, at the end of the hour, I was very satisfied. Last night, I think, was the first one that left me wanting more because we didn't really get, the people who I know who went through Calgary. We didn't get, like you said, they didn't talk a lot about Brett's career. It was a lot about Brett as a kid. So, like, I want Stampede Part 2, but.
Well, think of the names that I mentioned: Brian Pillman, Jim Neidhart, Davey Boy Smith, Dynamite Kid.
Yep.
Those are the big names that everybody knows, and they're not with us.
Exactly.
So sad, but we got Brett, and did I mention Owen? Owen too.
Yeah, exactly. Obvious, of course, Owen. We love Owen, but every time we had that unfortunate happenstance where we lost someone else, which I guess last was with Jim. There's that classic picture of the Hart Foundation, the WWF, and they would they would black and white one person out, and when it got down to the last person in full color is Brett. Every time I see that picture, it just makes me want to wrap Bret Hart in bubble wrap.
Yeah, no kidding, for sure. All right, that said, let's wrap it up for today. So if you'd like to continue the conversation with John or myself about the territories or about any of the daily topics that we put out on the Daily Wrestling News Show, feel free to join the Daily Wrestling News Show Facebook group. If you're in Facebook right now watching it, then you can just search for Daily Wrestling News Show, or you can go to facebook.com/groups/wrestling news show, find it there, or you can follow me on Instagram at the Ryan Joy, and I post something pertaining to our show every single day. So with that, we will see everybody on the podcast tomorrow.
See ya.